The wind had gone still after sunset, leaving the hills so silent it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the small cabin, Rohan Stormwolf sat at his rough pine table, a half-drunk mug of coffee cooling beside him. His elbows rested on the wood, his hands clasped loosely, eyes lost in the quiet hum of the stove. The place was plain, one room, one bed, a stove, a bench, but everything had its order. Against the wall, near the door, leaned his Henry rifle, always within reach. Not because he expected trouble, but because in these parts, trouble came when you least expected it. Rohan 38 had seen more of war and death than any man ought to. Once he'd ridden with the cavalry, watched the mud swallow good men whole, and when the war was done, he'd buried the noise of it by working a forgotten piece of land, bought with his soldiers' pay. He liked it that way, miles from anyone, the quiet, his only company. His mind wandered to the north fence, wondering if it needed fixing before the snow came, when a sound broke through the stillness. 2 soft knocks. Not firm, not angry, almost hesitant. Rohan froze, every sense awake. No one came this far without a reason. He rose slowly, boots whispering against the wood floor, his hand hovering near the latch. His thoughts flicked through possibilities: a lost traveler, a drifter, or worse, a man bringing trouble. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. A woman stood there barefoot in the dust. Her feet were cut and white with cold, her legs trembling as though she'd walked for days. She couldn't have been older than 24. The deerskin dress clinging to her was torn and travel-stained, frayed at the shoulders and hem. The neckline hung low, torn, just enough to show the hollow of her throat. Her skin, kissed by the cold, shimmered in the moonlight. Long black hair fell wild around her shoulders, tangled with bits of leather and beads. She was breathing fast like she'd been running, and her dark eyes were sharp, watching him as if ready to bolt. Something shifted in Rohan, not desire, not yet, but awareness. She looked small against the vast night behind her. "You lost." His voice came out lower than he meant. She shook her head once, still staring. "You hurt?" he asked again. Another shake, though her knees wavered, ready to give out. Rohan hesitated. Out here, no one was obliged to help a stranger, but sending her back into the dark would be signing her death. He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in." She paused, glancing past him into the cabin, jaw tight, like she was forcing herself not to flee. Then she stepped inside, silent, cautious. Warmth from the stove met her first. She stood near it, but didn't touch anything. Rohan shut the door behind her, sealing out the cold. Up close, she seemed even smaller, her back straight, her hands hanging at her sides, eyes still wary. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the bench. She didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, guarded. Rohan poured the last of his coffee into a tin cup and placed it on the table. "It's warm. Take it." She crossed the room slowly, took the cup with both hands. Her fingers were scraped raw nails, chipped. She drank in tiny sips like someone who'd forgotten what warmth tasted like. "You hungry?" A slight nod. Rohan cut off a chunk of bread, added a piece of salt pork, and slid the plate to her. She sat eating quietly, every bite, careful, deliberate, like each one mattered. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her. No one walked barefoot through desert country at night without reason. When she finished, she set the plate aside and stared into the fire again. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. She stayed quiet a long time before answering. "Camp," she said finally, her English broken but steady. "Not go back." Rohan's jaw tightened. He'd heard that before: women cast out for fighting back, or simply for saying no. "You can stay the night," he said at last. Her eyes flicked toward him, searching his face for meaning, then returned to the fire. She nodded once. Rohan placed a wool blanket beside her on the bench. She didn't thank him, just pulled it tight around her shoulders, her small frame half swallowed by the fabric. For a long while neither spoke. The fire popped softly, and the night pressed close against the log walls. Rohan sat again at the table, his rough hands folded before him, watching her in silence. Slowly he saw the tension leave her shoulders as the warmth began to sink in. What he felt wasn't pity, something quieter, more deliberate. It had been months since anyone shared the same roof with him, and now this stranger made the cabin feel less like a hiding place and more like somewhere that mattered. The fire burned low, glowing red across the room. Anea Moonshadow hadn't moved since she'd finished her meal. She sat wrapped tight in the blanket, staring into the stove, as though the faint flame was all that kept her from falling apart. The sound of her breathing changed the air, soft but real, reminding him he wasn't alone anymore. "You walked far," he said at last, his voice even. She nodded slowly. 3 nights. No fire. He looked at her. Then her lips cracked, faint bruises on her shins, the marks of someone who had fought the land itself to stay alive. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. For a while she said nothing. Then, quietly, they said I took a knife to a man. He grabbed me. Her eyes lifted to him, testing. Rohan's jaw clenched. "Did you?" "Yes," she answered simply. "He lived." Rohan leaned back, letting out a slow breath. That was enough. He'd seen too many like her people cast out, punished for surviving. "You're safe here," he said finally. Her shoulders loosened just barely, but he noticed. She began untying the strip of rawhide at her knee, and the blanket slipped, revealing scraped skin and dirt ground into shallow cuts. When she caught him looking, she drew the blanket tighter. "Water?" she asked softly. "Yeah." He stood glad to move, filled the basin from the barrel, and set it beside the stove. Handing her a clean cloth, he stepped back to give her space. She washed her hands first, then her arms, then her face. Slow, deliberate movements that seemed to wash away more than dirt. When she was done, the water had turned dark. Rohan carried the basin outside and emptied it into the cold night. The air stung his skin. He stood there a moment thinking about what he'd done, taking in a stranger, one who might bring danger to his door. But turning her away would have been worse. When he came back, she was on the bench again, the blanket sliding slightly to reveal her shoulder, her damp hair shining red gold in the firelight. "You'll sleep there tonight," he said, nodding at the bench. "I'll keep the fire going." She looked from the bench back to him. "You won't send me out, no," he said, his voice steady. "Not tonight." Anea watched him for a long heartbeat, then nodded once and lay down, curling beneath the blanket as the fire hummed softly between them. Anea curled up on her side knees, drawn close beneath the blanket. Rohan stayed seated at the table, listening as her breathing settled soft, steady, almost fragile against the rhythm of the fire. He didn't mean to stay awake so long, but he couldn't pull his eyes away from her. The firelight brushed her skin with a faint gold hue, shadows dancing over her face. When the wind outside rattled the shutters, she stirred, clutching the blanket tighter, but never waking. Rohan rose quietly, crossed the floor, and tugged the wool higher over her shoulders. For a moment he just stood there, studying the delicate curve of her cheek, the smallness of her hands resting near her face. Something inside him shifted again, deeper this time. It had been years since he'd had to think about someone else's safety besides his own. He fed another log into the fire and settled in the chair beside it until warmth filled the room. His eyelids grew heavy, but sometime in the dark hours, a sound brought him back a soft whimper. He turned toward the bench. Anea twisted in her sleep, her brow tight, one hand fisting the blanket. Rohan knelt beside her, his voice low. "You're all right," he murmured, not wanting to frighten her. Her eyes flew open, wide alert. For a heartbeat, she looked ready to flee until recognition softened her gaze. Her breath slowed, and she shut her eyes again. Rohan stayed there a while longer, waiting for her breathing to even out before returning to his chair. He didn't sleep again. When dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, the cabin glowed with gray morning light. Rohan was still by the fire when Anea stirred, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "You go?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," he said. "Coffee first." He poured 2 cups and set one before her. She took it carefully, both hands around the tin, her eyes never leaving him, as if still deciding whether he was a man she could trust. By the time the light filled the cabin, Rohan already knew he wouldn't ask her to leave, not today. He stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans left to soak overnight. The smell of salt pork and smoke thickened the air. Anea sat at the table this time, the blanket still on her shoulders, but her posture straighter, less defensive than before. She watched him as he worked, curious, as if trying to read what kind of man he was. Rohan felt her gaze on him, and though he pretended not to notice his movements, softened slower, quieter. He slid a plate toward her. She hesitated only a second before eating. Her pace was steady, respectful, leaving nothing behind. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She looked up cautious, as though offering that truth might cost her something. Then she nodded. "Anea," she said. "Anea," he repeated, letting the name settle in the air. She didn't ask his, just went on eating. Rohan didn't mind. When the meal was done, he shrugged into his coat. "Need to check the north fence," he said. "Cattle find every weak spot this time of year." Anea frowned faintly, not catching every word. Rohan pointed toward the hills, made a walking motion with 2 fingers, then pointed north. Her face eased. She understood. Anea gave a small nod and glanced toward the bench like she was silently asking if that was where she should wait. "You can stay inside," Rohan said. "Fire's going. It'll keep you warm." He stepped out into the morning chill, the air sharp enough to bite. His eyes scanned the low hills, half expecting to see riders in the distance, scouts maybe from wherever she'd come. Someone searching for her. But there was nothing. Just the wide open land stretching toward the horizon. The north fence was still holding, but Rohan walked the line anyway, checked the posts, pulled at sagging wire. Out here keeping busy kept a man's mind from drifting too far into places it didn't need to go. Still, with every step, his thoughts circled back to the cabin, to her, to the way she'd said her name, like it might vanish if she ever said it again. Anea. By the time he returned, the sun had risen higher, the frost lifting slightly from the ground. Then he stopped in his tracks. She was outside, Anea crouched beside the woodpile, her blanket laid to the side. The deerskin dress hung loose around her shoulders as she carefully stacked kindling with cold, reddened fingers. Rohan walked over slowly. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. She looked up at him, then back to the pile. "I help?" She answered plainly. He crouched beside her, picked up the hatchet, and showed her how to split the wood finer. Short, steady strokes. She watched first, then took the hatchet herself. Her grip was clumsy, but her effort was solid. The kindling split unevenly at first, but she didn't stop until a neat stack formed beside her. Rohan said nothing, just felt something shift in his chest. Quiet, unexpected comfort in having another soul moving across his land. Later, he hauled a bucket of water in from the well. When he stepped inside, he found her sweeping the floor with the short broom, her face calm, not waiting for permission. He paused in the doorway, watching the fringe of her dress sway with each motion. "You don't have to do all that," he said. She straightened, met his gaze with a look that held more strength than apology. "I stay, I work." He nodded slowly. "Out here, that was the way." Everyone pulled their weight. Otherwise, nothing got done. By mid-afternoon, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, the floor clean. Rohan fixed a simple meal, and they ate together, still mostly in silence. Every now and then, Anaya's eyes would shift toward the door, her expression tightening like she was bracing for something. After a long, quiet stretch, Rohan asked, "Anyone looking for you?" Her hands paused over her plate, jaw clenched before she spoke. "Maybe, but I not go back." He studied her. "If they come here, I'll handle it." She glanced at him sharply, searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have been enough because she nodded and went back to eating. As the sun began to fall behind the hills, Rohan went out to grab more firewood. When he returned, Anaya was standing close to the flames, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, hands outstretched to the warmth. The blanket had slipped, revealing the neckline of her dress, her collarbone catching the flicker of firelight. Rohan set the logs down a little harder than he meant to, then turned toward the stove, pretending to focus. When night settled, he fed the fire again to keep the room warm. Anaya took her place on the bench legs tucked beneath her, watching him through lowered lashes. "You staying tomorrow?" he asked. Not even sure why he said it. Her expression didn't shift at first. Then softly it did. "If you let me." Rohan nodded once. "Then stay," Rohan said, and that was the last either of them spoke. Anaya lay down on the bench, curling toward the fire. Rohan eased back into his chair as the wind outside picked up, rattling faintly against the shutters. But for the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel so hollow. Night dropped fast, cloaking the world outside in shadow. The fire cast a steady glow, turning the room into a flickering island of warmth in the dark. Rohan sat at the table, carefully cleaning his rifle. His hands moved slow, familiar cloth, through barrel fingers wiping down the stock. The rhythm steadied him, kept his thoughts from circling too closely around the woman stretched out across the room. Anaya had wrapped herself in the blanket but hadn't drifted off yet. She lay on her side, facing the fire, her dark hair spilling over her shoulder. The soft curve of bare skin peeked out where the deerskin had slipped, catching the firelight. She didn't fix it. Maybe she didn't notice. Maybe she didn't care. But Rohan noticed. He dropped his gaze back to the rifle, ran the cloth through again. Still, every few moments his eyes strayed. He hadn't meant for her to stay more than a single night. The plan had been simple: give her food, warmth, rest, and send her on. But morning had come and gone, and she was still here, splitting wood, sweeping the floor, moving around like she'd always been part of this place. Rohan finished cleaning the rifle and set it aside. The fire snapped, filling the silence. "You sure no one followed you?" he asked quietly. Anaya opened her eyes, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. "No one," she said, voice low. "I walked far, left no trail." Rohan nodded, though the answer didn't ease him much. "If anyone comes, I want you to tell me before they get too close." She blinked, surprised by the request, as if she wasn't used to anyone asking for her trust. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll tell." Rohan leaned back in his chair legs, stretched toward the fire. "You planning to move on after this?" Her expression tightened. She hesitated, then spoke. "I got nowhere to go. If I go back, they'll beat me. Maybe worse." Rohan's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough cruelty in his lifetime to know she wasn't exaggerating. "Then stay," he said, simple and firm. She blinked, caught off guard. "You'll let me?" "As long as you pull your weight," he replied. "And as long as you want to be here." A pause. Then she nodded slowly, her face softening as she turned back to the fire. Rohan added another log. Sparks flared briefly, lighting her profile. He settled into the chair again, feeling the weight of it all land square in his chest. It had been so long since someone else shared this space. Too long. And she was something else, young, proud, with that sharp gaze, like she was still waiting to see if he'd fail her like the rest had. Her breathing slowed. He thought she'd fallen asleep, until she stirred, sat up, and pushed the blanket aside. "Too warm," she murmured, setting it down. Rohan's eyes flicked toward her before he could stop them. The dress hung loose around her neckline, open just enough to show her collarbone, and a faint bruise on her arm. He turned back to the fire quickly, guilt crawling up his spine. "Who hurt you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then, in a voice flat and tired, she said, "Man from camp. The one I cut." Rohan's fists tightened on the table. He didn't ask for more. Didn't need to. He gave a single firm nod. "Ain't no one gonna lay a hand on you here." Something shifted in her face, like a layer of stone cracking just a little. "You mean that I mean it?" Anea studied him for a long moment. Firelight catching the dark depth in her eyes, then finally lay back down. But this time she faced him, not the fire. Rohan lingered at the table, hands idle, unable to focus. The room suddenly felt warmer, more alive. Eventually he stood stirred, the coals tossed in another log, and set the rifle gently back against the wall. When he turned, her gaze was still on him, watchful, unreadable in the shadows. "Why you live alone?" she asked, voice soft but direct. The question struck harder than expected. He hadn't spoken of it in years, but no one else was here to hear it now. "My wife passed," he said at last, the words dry and heavy. "Some years ago. After that, I didn't want to be around folks." Anea's expression softened just slightly. "You still love her?" Rohan swallowed, nodded once. "Yeah." She turned toward the fire again. "Then you a good man?" He didn't know how to answer that. So he said nothing, just sank back into the chair and let the silence stretch between them. Her breathing slowed, her body eased into sleep. Rohan stayed right there, unmoving, watching her, until the fire burned low and shadows crept in. He didn't remember dozing off, but somewhere in the dark a sound stirred him. A soft gasp, sharp with fear. He looked over to see Anea twitching in her sleep, her hand gripping the edge of the bench. Rohan stood quickly, crossed the room, crouched beside her. "It's all right," he whispered low and steady. Her eyes flew open wide and lost. She flinched instinctively, pulling away, then stilled when she saw it was him. Rohan stayed where he was, still as stone, showing her she was safe. Her breath steadied. The tension in her shoulders loosened. Slowly, she released the bench. "You're safe," Rohan murmured again. She nodded, small and silent, then sank back onto the blanket. Rohan remained beside her a moment longer, then rose and returned to his chair. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came, he stoked the fire and set coffee to boil. For the first time in months, the place didn't feel empty with the sun coming up. The next morning broke clear and cold frost glistening along the grass outside the cabin. Rohan had been up since before light, moving quieter than usual. When the smell of brewing coffee reached Anea, she stirred on the bench. She sat up, pulling the blanket tight, her dark hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes sharp, watching him, making sure he was still there. "You sleep?" Rohan asked without turning. She nodded. "Better." Just that word "better" settled something inside his chest. He set a tin plate down for her, then took his own across from her. They ate in quiet, but it was the good kind of quiet. After breakfast, Rohan grabbed his coat. "Got wood to split." Anea stood too, setting the plate aside. "I help." He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but mind your feet. That axe don't play." Outside, the air bit cold and dry. Rohan set a log upright and brought the axe down hard clean. Anea stood nearby, arms folded, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She watched every movement. After he'd split a dozen, she stepped forward without asking, kneeling, stacking each piece in neat rows. A rhythm took hold. Rohan split. Anea stacked. When her blanket slipped off, she let it. Worked bare-shouldered, her deerskin dress brushing against her knees. Rohan caught himself watching, then forced his focus back to the axe. By mid-morning he paused, resting the axe head on the stump. "That's enough." Anea wiped her palms on her dress, then turned toward the hills beyond. Something clouded her gaze. "What is it?" Rohan asked, voice tightening. She hesitated, then lifted her hand, pointing out. Rohan turned, squinting. At first, nothing. Then, dust. Rising slow. Figures 2, maybe 3 on horseback. Moving careful. His jaw locked. Inside, he muttered, already reaching for the rifle by the wall. Anea didn't question him. She slipped into the cabin without a sound. Rohan stood alone by the woodpile. Rifle in hand. Steady. Waiting. As they rode close enough for their faces to come clear, Rohan saw 2 men he didn't recognize. Hard-faced, road-worn types with rifles tucked into their saddle scabbards and dust thick on their coats. They drew up near the front yard. "Mornin'," one called out, tipping his hat without a smile. "Mornin'," Rohan answered, his tone flat. "We're looking for a girl came this way," the man said. "Apache girl, young. You seen her?" Rohan didn't move a muscle. "Can't say I have." The man's gaze slid toward the cabin. "Mind if we look around?" "I do mind." Rohan's voice stayed calm, but his hand on the rifle tightened just enough to show he meant it. The second rider shifted in the saddle, frowning. "We ain't here for trouble, mister. Just need to bring her back." Rohan stepped forward, placing himself square between them and the cabin door. His stance said it all. "She's not here, you asked," he said, voice low and solid. "Now you can ride on." The first man's jaw clenched. For a beat, Rohan thought he might press the matter, but then the man's eyes flicked to the rifle, and he backed down. "Fine," he muttered, turning his horse. "If you see her, tell her folks are looking." They rode off, slow-casting looks over their shoulders like men not quite convinced. Rohan didn't lower the rifle until the last of their dust vanished into the wide land. When he stepped back into the cabin, Anea stood near the fire, her hands clenched tight. "They'll come back," she said. It wasn't a question. Maybe Rohan admitted. "But they won't take you. Not from here." She looked up at him, then searching his face. "Why?" she asked, softly. Rohan set the rifle down with care. "Because you're under my roof," he said. "And I don't let men like that take what's mine." Something shifted in her, something deep. Maybe it was relief, maybe something else. She stepped toward him slowly until she stood close enough for the firelight to dance in her eyes. "You mean that," she whispered. "I mean it," he said, without hesitation. They stood like that, the air between them heavy with everything unspoken, the world outside full of danger. But in that moment it felt like the walls held a peace they both needed. Anea reached up and laid her hand softly on his chest. Rohan froze, not out of fear, but because he felt it too much. She didn't speak again, just let her hand rest there a moment before stepping back and returning to the bench. Rohan exhaled, steadying himself. Then he poured her a fresh cup of water, sat at the table, and faced her. "You can stay," he said. Quiet. Certain. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "Then I stay." They had supper early that evening. Not much was said. But the quiet wasn't awkward. It was shared. Later, when the fire had burned down, Rohan added a fresh log, making sure the warmth would last till dawn. Anea lay on the bench again. This time she faced him. Her eyes stayed on him until sleep finally pulled them shut. When Rohan drifted off, it was the first time in a long while he didn't feel like the only soul on earth. The morning after the land felt sharper, like even the wind was watchful. Rohan rose early, checked the rifle before the coffee, and took a long look around the homestead. No tracks. No dust. Just empty land stretching far and wide. But still his guard stayed up. When he stepped back inside, Anea was already awake. She'd folded the blanket and placed it neatly aside. Her long, dark hair fell over one shoulder as she sat at the table watching. Not wary. Alert. Like she too knew it wasn't over yet. "They gone?" she asked. For now, Rohan replied, setting the rifle back against the wall. "Didn't see any fresh tracks?" She gave a slow nod, tension easing from her shoulders. Rohan poured coffee into 2 tin cups and slid one across to her. She wrapped her hands around it, took a long sip, steam rising to meet her face. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said, meeting her eyes. "I was afraid before," she replied. "Not now." Rohan nodded, and something inside him that had been wound tight for months loosened. After breakfast, he grabbed his tools and headed toward the corral. The cattle had been edgy since the wind turned. He needed to check the rails. Anea followed him outside her steps, quiet behind his. "You don't have to," he began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "I work," she said simply. Rohan gave her a short nod. "All right then." He showed her how to hold the hammer, how to brace the rail. She watched once, then did it herself. No fuss, no complaints. When she missed and bruised her thumb, she only hissed through her teeth and kept going. By noon, they'd fixed the fence, split wood, and hauled 2 pails of water from the well. Rohan hadn't realized how much faster everything went, with someone beside him. For months, the days had stretched out in quiet repetition. Now there was someone beside him passing tools into his hands, stacking wood, as he chopped it, keeping stride without complaint. Inside the cabin, Rohan set the kettle on and glanced her way. Sweat clung to Anea's temples, and streaks of earth ran along her arms and knees. But on her face was a calm resolve, a pride that hadn't been there before. "You worked hard," he said, voice rough, but sincere. Her lips curled into the barest smile. "I stay. I work." Rohan nodded once, unable to trust his voice with anything more. They shared another meal that evening, less tense, now quieter in a more natural way. Anea offered more this time, fragments of her life. 2 younger brothers, both lost. A father gone 2 winters back. Rohan listened, hands rough and still on the table, letting her control the pace. When her voice fell quiet, he spoke. I fought in the war. Thought I'd seen the worst men could do back then. He paused, jaw tight. Turns out I hadn't. Anea looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. You lost many. Too many, he said. Boys I knew since I could run. Then my wife. After that I got tired of graves. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not cold. Anea reached across the table and brushed her fingers against his wrist. Rohan didn't move. He let the touch settle like sunlight on weathered stone until she slowly pulled away. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet rhythm. Rohan repaired the busted hinge on the barn door. Anea brushed down the mare, her hands moving with steady care along the horse's flanks. From time to time, Rohan's eyes found her again, something warm blooming deep in his chest, a feeling long buried. As dusk arrived, the sky burned gold, throwing long shadows across the yard. Rohan stacked the last of the firewood near the porch. Anea leaned on the fence, gaze lost in the fading colors. When he stepped beside her, she didn't pull away. This place, she whispered, feels quiet. That's why I built it, Rohan said. Silence helps a man hold himself together. Anea turned, meeting his gaze. You were lost. Rohan swallowed hard. Was he admitted? Maybe not so much now. That night he lit the fire early. Anea sat cross-legged near the stove, stitching a tear in her dress with thread Rohan had found in an old tin box. Rohan sat nearby, carving a thin piece of wood to nothing in his fingers. The air between them had changed easier now, like the worst of the fear had passed. When she finished sewing, Anea stood and slipped the dress back on, smoothing the fabric down over her hips. Rohan's eyes caught the curve of her waist, before he forced his gaze back to the bit of wood in his hands. You should take the bed tonight, he said abruptly. Anea blinked. In you? No, Rohan replied, managing a half smile. I'll take the bench. Slept enough nights by the fire anyway. She looked like she might argue, but then gave a single nod. All right. Later, as she lay beneath the quilt, Rohan turned his back to the flames and stared into the darkness until her breathing steadied. Soft, even, familiar. For the first time in years, he let himself wonder what if she never left. The next morning he woke with a crick in his neck and sunlight creeping through the shutters. At first he thought the place was empty, but then came the sound of stirring near the stove. Anea crouched there, her long hair falling across one shoulder, stirring the pot with slow grace. You're up early, Rohan muttered, sitting upright and rubbing his neck. She looked back over her shoulder. Fire low. I make hot. He crossed to the stove. The beans were simmering, rich with the scent of salt and smoke. You did good, he said simply. They ate without many words, but the silence was no longer uneasy. Rohan caught himself watching her, the way the light played in her hair, the quiet focus in her expression. She was still a stranger in many ways, but not a passing one. After breakfast, Rohan grabbed his coat and rifle. Riding East Line, checking for signs. Won't be long. I go, Anea said suddenly. He turned surprised. You sure? She nodded, wrapping the blanket tighter. I know Hill now. Rohan studied her a moment, then nodded. All right, stay close. They rode double on his mare Rohan in the saddle, Anea behind him. Her arms circled his waist. Not tight, just present. At first, the contact felt strange, too familiar. But mile after mile, something eased inside him, and he began to welcome the quiet, steady rhythm of her there. The east fence line held steady, no signs of riders, no fresh tracks, just a couple of mule deer slipping through the brush like ghosts. Anea didn't speak much, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched the horizon like she was burning every ridge and tree into memory. When they rode back, Rohan slid down first, then reached up to help her. Her fingers lingered on his forearm, not from fear, something softer. Gratitude. Quiet and real. The day moved along, simple and steady. Rohan fixed the chicken coop hinges while Anea gathered kindling and swept the dust from the barn floor. They crossed paths more than once, and every time something loosened between them. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt comfortable. That night after supper, Rohan fed the fire until it glowed strong. Anea sat tucked on the bench legs, folded beneath her eyes on him. "You stay here long?" she asked out of nowhere. He looked up. "For years. Since the war." "You know, lonely?" Her voice was quiet. Rohan let out a dry chuckle, no humor in it. "Plenty lonely? Got used to it?" Anea went still. "I know like lonely," she whispered. Her dark eyes caught the firelight as they met his. "You're not alone now," he said. She didn't move at first. Then she stepped toward him, slow, stopping just in front of where he sat. Her hand found his on the table, small fingers brushing against his. He turned his palm upward, let her slip her hand into his. "You're safe here," he said again, voice low and sure. Anea nodded, her features softening. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently to his shoulder. Rohan didn't move for a long moment. Then carefully he raised his free hand and rested it against her back. The warmth between them settled like the fire's glow. When she pulled away, the whole cabin felt different, quieter, warmer, changed. "You should take the bed again tonight," Rohan said. She searched his face for doubt. There was none. She nodded once and walked to lie down. Rohan stayed by the fire a while longer, but sleep tugged slow at him. When he finally stretched out on the bench, he lay listening to the wind, to the soft rhythm of her breath. Around midnight, Anea stirred. She sat up in the low orange flicker of dying coals. "You cold?" she asked. He turned toward her. "I'm all right." "You sleep bad," she said softly. Then, "Come." He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. Bench hard. Bed big. Rohan stood every step toward her, a quiet decision. He lay down on the edge of the bed, careful to keep space between them. She turned on her side to face him. They said nothing, just stared in the dim hush fire popping now and then. Rohan reached out slowly, brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. "Good night," he whispered. "Good night," she echoed. And when sleep came, it came easy for the first time in years. He woke before dawn, still as stone. The bed was warm. The air chilled his face. Anea slept beside him, breath slow and even. Her hair had spilled across the blanket like ink over paper. He rose carefully, stirring the fire back to life. Flames flickered up again, chasing off the cold. When Anea finally opened her eyes and sat up, wrapping the blanket tighter, her gaze met his shy, unsure, but no longer afraid. "You get used to the bed?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than ground?" A rare smile touched his lips. "Yeah, better than the ground." They shared breakfast. Not much was said, but the air between them was easier, now warmer. Rohan lingered at the table longer than he meant to. not ready to step away from that quiet comfort. By mid-morning, he saddled the mare. "Got a ride to town," he said, adjusting the cinch. "Supplies running low. Want to check the talk, too, after those riders." "You stay here," he added, tipping his head toward the cabin. Anea hesitated. "Safe that way." He nodded. She met his eyes. "I wait." The ride took most of the day. At the general store, he bought flour coffee rifle rounds and kept his ears open. Two old-timers by the stove spoke in hushed tones about trouble near the reservation. Young bloods stirring dust, some betrayal thrown in, but no mention of a runaway woman. By sundown, Rohan was already heading back hard, determined to beat the dark. As the last light died, his cabin came into view. Smoke curled from the chimney like a promise. Relief eased something deep in Rohan Stormwolf's chest, something he hadn't even realized had been wound tight. When he stepped inside the cabin, the heat hit him first, then the scent of stew, then the sight of Anea Moonshadow kneeling by the hearth, stirring a pot over the open flame. She looked up at the sound of the door, and for a heartbeat her expression softened, something near to joy flickering in her eyes. "You came back," she said quietly. "Yeah," Rohan replied, setting the sack of supplies down. "Town was quiet. No trouble." She nodded. "Looks like we're safe for now." Then she stood and brought him a bowl, setting it gently on the table. The beans were hot, rich with spice, better than anything he'd made for himself. "You cooked?" he asked. Anea nodded. "You worked?" "I prepared." He took a bite, then another. "You did real good," he murmured. That night they sat together by the fire. The cabin held only the soft pop of burning logs and the whisper of wind against the windows. Rohan sat on the bench. Anea stayed on the floor near the stove, knees drawn to her chest. The silence between them no longer strained. It hummed with something unspoken. After a long pause, Anea looked at him. "You think they'll come back?" Rohan set his mug down. "Maybe. But if they do, they'll learn I wasn't bluffing." She was quiet a moment, then asked softly, "Do you always fight for people?" He stared into the flames. "Not always. But when it counts." "Yeah." Anea considered that. Then she rose, moved toward him, and sat on the edge of the bench, close, but not quite touching. The nearness of her sent heat crawling up Rohan's neck. "You don't have to be scared of me," he said gently. "I'm not," she replied. Her voice was steady. "I trust you." Rohan turned to look at her. In the firelight, her face was open, and what he saw there stole the breath from his lungs. It wasn't just gratitude. It was deeper. He reached out slowly, brushing a strand of her dark hair from her cheek with his rough fingers. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they sat like that, unmoving. Then Rohan leaned in and kissed her slow, deliberate, no rush. His hand rested lightly at the base of her neck, anchoring her to the moment. When he drew back, Anea held his gaze. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." They didn't say anything after that. Anea lay down on the bed, and Rohan stayed by the fire, watching it burn low. Eventually, he joined her, lying closer than the night before. She didn't shift away. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breath beside him. And for the first time since she'd arrived, a thought settled in his chest like a stone. In calm water, he didn't want her to go. Not in the morning. Not ever. He let himself picture it, this cabin, not so empty. A life that wasn't just about surviving. A life where she was still here. When his eyes finally closed, He knew one thing for sure. Come morning, he wouldn't just tell her she could stay. He'd tell her he wanted her to. Rohan woke to the smell of smoke and boiling water. For a heartbeat, he was disoriented. Then he turned and saw her Anaya by the stove. Hair loose, focused on her task. The sight grounded him like nothing else had in years. "You always beat me up now," he said, voice gravelly from sleep. Anaya glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile on her lips. "I try. You work, I prepare." He swung his legs off the bed. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said simply, turning back to the pot. They ate breakfast in silence, the clink of the spoon against tin the only sound. Rohan watched her move each step, sure, each motion practiced. The fear that once shadowed her was gone. After the meal, Rohan stood reaching for his coat. "I'm going to check the west pasture. Last of the fence needs looking after." "I'll come," she said, already standing. He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Together they saddled the mare and rode out beneath a pale blue sky, one of those crisp mornings that hinted at snow. Anaya sat behind him again, her arms wrapped around his middle, steady and warm. And once more Rohan felt that quiet certainty settle in his chest. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. "No riders," Anaya said quietly after scanning the horizon. Rohan gave a small nod. "Been a few days now." Once the fence was repaired, they rode back at an easy pace. Rohan stayed silent most of the way, thoughts circling around the idea that the danger had passed, at least for now. From what he heard in town, no one's looking. No posse, no price on her head. But he could sense it. Anaya had been waiting for him to say something, to give her a sign. When they reached the cabin, he swung down and helped her off the horse. But instead of leading the mare to the corral, he stood by the hitching post, one hand still on the reins. "Anaya," he said, turning to her. She looked up at him, her expression open but guarded. "Yes." Rohan swallowed. Time to say what had been gnawing at his chest. "You don't have to go," he said. "Not tomorrow, not ever." He met her gaze, steady and firm. "This place. It's yours if you want it." Her brow furrowed like she hadn't expected the words to be that plain. "You want me here, I do," he said. "It's been just me in this cabin too long. You've changed that, made it better." She didn't answer right away. The wind caught her hair and tossed it gently across her cheek. Then she stepped forward so close she was almost touching his chest. "I stay," she whispered. "With you." Rohan exhaled the tension, leaving him like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then it settled. Inside the fire still burned warm in the hearth. Anaya set aside her blanket and began tidying the table, but Rohan reached out his hand, gentle on her arm. "You don't need to be working every second," he murmured. "Sit with me." She paused, then slowly sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. Rohan reached for her hand. His thumb traced the back of her fingers. "You were scared that night," he said quietly. "Truth is, I was too." Anaya looked at him, eyes calm and unwavering. "Not scared of you? Scared of letting someone in again?" He nodded. "Yeah, same." "You're not scared now?" she asked. Rohan met her eyes and shook his head. "No, not anymore." She held his gaze a moment longer, then leaned in, brushing his lips with hers. The kiss was soft, and certain, her fingers resting gently along his jaw. Rohan kissed her back, slow and sure, the fire popping softly in the quiet. When they pulled apart, Anaya stayed close, resting her head on his shoulder. "What about the men?" she asked after a moment. They're not coming back, he said, calm and certain. And if they do, they'll find me waiting. She nodded against him, her body relaxing for the first time completely. The rest of the day passed in a kind of quiet harmony. They moved around the cabin like they'd done this forever. Rohan fixed a broken latch on the door. Anea mended a torn seam in his shirt. At dusk, they shared a simple meal and then lingered by the fire long after the dishes were cleaned. When the light had faded to embers, Rohan stood and held out his hand. She didn't hesitate. He led her to the bed. This time there was no space left between them. The firelight threw soft shadows on the wall. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and kissed her again, slower, deeper. Under the blanket, she curled into him, her head resting over his heart. "You're safe now," he murmured, his hand warm against her back. "I know," she whispered. "And so are you." Rohan let his eyes close. The fire whispered and cracked in the stillness. For the first time in years, the weight on his soul lifted. The cabin didn't feel like a place to hide anymore. It felt like home. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the shutters, but inside, they slept together warm and whole. And when morning came, Anea was still there, still beside him, still choosing to stay.